Hello everyone, Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about English. In this video, we are going to look at language, form and structure. So these terms, language, form and structure, are three of the most important elements of the assessment objectives for GCSE English, both language and literature, although form is not mentioned in the language AO. So if we start with the literature AO2, as you can see, analyze the language, form, and structure used by a writer to create meanings and effects using relevant subject terminology where appropriate. For the language AO2, explain, comment on, and analyze how writers use language and structure to achieve effects and influence readers using relevant subject terminology to support their views. And it's absolutely critical to understand what these terms mean if you are to do well in your English exams. So we're going to start with simple definitions. So language means words and phrases. Okay, you have to pick out words and phrases and discuss their effects and connotations, as we'll see later on. Form means type or genre. But there are sub-levels here, okay? So at the top level, you have to ask yourself, is it a novel? Is it a play? Is it a poem? And then within each category there, for a novel, you might ask, is it a horror novel? Is it an adventure novel? For a poem, you might ask, is it a sonnet? Is it a dramatic monologue? Or some other kind of poem? Structure means beginning, middle, and end. And for all of these things, you have to consider the effects and connotations. So effects means thoughts, feelings, images that come to mind when you read a word or a phrase, or it might be a structural technique. And connotations means the alternative meanings of a word or associations of a word. Now, these two things are mostly to do with language, but they are also to do with form and structure, especially structure. So with structure, you do have to think about the effects of the structural choices that the writer has made. But with structure, you might think more also in terms of what questions are raised in your mind as you read the beginning, middle, and end of a text. And then techniques and terminology. So techniques means similes, metaphors, personification, etc. And of course, that's to do with language. In terms of structure, although the basic definition of structure is beginning, middle, and end, there are other structural techniques, for example, flashback, flash forward. And word classes, remember, for example, nouns, verbs, adjectives, also count as techniques, or if you like, you can think of them as using terminology which is part of the AO. So therefore, if you use the correct terminology, as opposed to just saying the writer uses the word, right? You might say the writer uses the noun or the adjective, blah, blah, blah. When do you need to worry about the difference between language, form, and structure? So there's good and bad news here. The good news is that the only time you have to worry about the difference between language and structure is in language paper 1, question 2, and question 3, and also language paper 2, question 3. So paper 1, question 2 is the language question, and you must only discuss language. In other words, words and phrases and their effects and connotations. The further good news here is that most students do understand this quite easily, okay? So this question is not the problem really. Question 3 is the structure question, and this is where the major problem lies. Students find it very difficult to understand the difference between language and structure, and they often end up talking about language in the structure question. The easiest solution to this problem is to remember that this question is only worth 8 marks, and therefore please don't spend too much time on it. Okay, maybe leave it to the end, something like that. But do not spend more than 10 minutes on this question. The next easier solution is to just write 3 sentences about the beginning, middle, and end and move on quickly. I mean, that's obviously linking back to the point I've just made. Believe it or not, there is a good chance that you will get a few marks for this. Ideally, you do not want to leave the question out entirely and get 0 marks, okay? So I'm not suggesting that you leave it out entirely, but do not spend more than 10 minutes, and just as a minimum, just write 3 sentences and move on. Further nuance, so nuance means a subtle kind of minor, small point, rather detailed point, I should say, is that you're always supposed to give evidence when making points, right? Usually this is not a problem, but in the case of structure, when students give the evidence, they then start to analyze that evidence, okay? And this is when they start going into language analysis, even though the original point may well have been to do with structure. Of course, you would get the marks for the structural point that you make, and no marks will be deducted for the language analysis, but the time spent on the language analysis will be wasted. And sometimes students spend half an hour on question 3 when they should be spending 10 minutes, and they write almost as much as question 4 and so on. And in the English language exam, there is not a moment to lose. So a simple solution here is to not give the evidence. But please note that this is the only situation where you can get away without giving evidence, okay? Only the structure question, language paper 1, question 3, the structure question, you can get away without giving the evidence, okay? But that's the only time you should ever do that. Okay, now let's have a look at the language papers. The funny thing is that the exam papers tell you what to do, and yet students still struggle. So, for example, the language paper 1, question 2, how does the writer use language here, blah, 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 right? And it tells you you could include, by the way, when it says could, it really means should, the writer's choice of words and phrases, language features and techniques, sentence forms. So there you go, words and phrases, it tells you what language means, okay? And also this. Sentence forms, my advice is, unless you're aiming for the highest grades, which we're going to talk about later, please don't focus on sentence forms. Students often jump straight into sentence forms, short sentences, long sentences, which are very easy to spot, but very difficult to actually make good points about. So my advice would be to focus on words and phrases, okay? And then language paper 1, questions 3, how has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? You could write about what the writer, and again, this means you should write about, what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source, how and why the writer changes this focus as the source develops, in other words, middle and end, any other structural features that interest you. So it tells you what structure means. It means beginning, middle, and end. Nowhere do you see any reference to layout, okay? Although, as I say, layout can sometimes be a tiny part of it, but we'll come to that later. And then language paper 2, question 3, how does the writer use language to describe? So this question is very similar to this question, all right? Except it doesn't give you these clues here. Okay. Now let's have a look at the literature papers. So in the case of the literature papers, the situation is slightly easier in that you don't have to worry about the differences as such, but you do need to cover all 3, language, form, and structure. The problem is that students tend to focus on language, which is fine for the lower grades, but will not get you to the higher grades. Now, there's good and bad news here as well. The bad news is, as already mentioned above, students tend to leave out form and structure. The good news is that you don't have to do very much with form and structure to get the higher grades, okay? It's not a case of doing 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. No. You can mostly focus on the language, but you do need to refer to form and structure, talk about form and structure a little bit, okay? And I'll give you some ideas on that in a minute. And now, so the literature exam covers the following topics, okay? A Shakespeare play, a novel, a modern play, and poetry. So let's have a look at those. So let's start with the basics. Quite often, students simply use the wrong term for the text they are discussing. For example, they will refer to a play as a novel, or vice versa, or to a poem as a story, right? So if you are discussing Macbeth or Inspector Calls, you should be using the word play. If you are discussing Christmas Carol or Jekyll and Hyde, you should be using the word novel, or better still, novella, which means short novel. If you are discussing poetry, you should be using the word poem. Now, this sounds really obvious, right? But it's amazing how often students make this mistake. And you must also select the correct term between reader and audience. If you are discussing novels or plays, you should refer to the effect on the reader. If you are discussing a play, you should refer to the effect on the audience, okay? Plays are meant to be seen on stage. They are not really meant to be read, although, of course, when we study plays, we do read them as well, okay? So, as a summary and example, and as an example, let's look at Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. So, grade 4-5 discussion here. I'm not going to go through the actual poem itself. For that, you need to look at the poetry video, the poetry course on this channel. Okay, but basically, this is a poem about a statue which is broken down in the desert, and it's about the breakdown of power and so on. Now, in terms of language, you might pick out words and phrases like antique, snare of cold command, king of kings. So you would pick out this word antique. It's obviously an adjective, and the effects and connotations are that antique, you would explain, means not just old, but very old. It means ancient. The connotations of antique means something of value, is precious, that kind of thing. Okay. In terms of form, you must refer to the text as a poem, right? And in this case, the fact that it's a sonnet. And then in terms of structure, you might say that the poem begins in the first person, I, but that most of the poem is in the third person. So from here to here, you can see it's in the third person. And then as you go through the poem, picking out words and phrases, try to link the beginning, middle, and end of the poem. And actually, as you're going through the poem, picking out words and phrases for the language, you are automatically kind of covering structure as well. Okay. If you can go one step further and try to link them, then even better. So you can see you really don't need to do a lot to get a grade 4-5. All right. Okay. If you're aiming higher than a grade 4 or 5, let's move on. So complications and common misconceptions. The most common misconceptions are to do with structure. Students often think that structure is to do with layout. Although layout is indeed a small part of structure, especially when it comes to poetry, it is not the most important aspect, okay? It's maybe 5%, 5 or 10% maximum, depending on what you're looking at. Now, in this case, it can be useful to separate abstract, which means non-physical, logical, so it's the content, right? Structure and physical structure. When we use the single word structure, we are usually referring to abstract structure. In other words, the content. How is the content organized from beginning to middle to end? And if we are talking about physical structure, then clearly the layout is completely valid. Right. Now, are language, form, and structure entirely separate? The truth is, right, and this is why people struggle with these things, is that you cannot really separate these things out. For example, where do the following fit in? Rhyme and rhythm, repetition, and sentences. So rhyme and rhythm are to do with form, okay? But some people place these in the category of structure. And we're going to talk more about that later on. Repetition can be both language and structure. If a word or phrase is repeated close together, for example, oh, 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 that is language. If the word to be repeated throughout a text, say mentioned at the beginning and kind of in the middle and then towards the end, it would be structure. Sentences can also be both language and structure. So if you were to talk about the effect of a short sentence in the language question, that's perfectly fine, right? You can just carry on and do that. But if you wanted to talk about the effect of a short sentence in the structure question, you would have to discuss it in relation to its location in the text. Okay, so for example, why does the writer begin the text with a short sentence, or why does he or she end it with a short sentence, or why is there this one single short sentence in the middle of the extract? Okay. And in terms of the literature exam, moving beyond the basics. So for novels, in Christmas Carol, for example, the chapters are called staves, which are the lines on music paper, which ties in with the fact that the word carol is a type of song. So if you were to kind of mention this, then you would be ticking the box of form. All right. If you talk about how the chapters are organized, are some longer or shorter than others? How do they begin and end? You're covering structure. Okay. For plays, think about acts and scenes. For example, all Shakespeare plays have 5 acts. I mean, I'm not suggesting you mention this, but I'm just mentioning it. Inspector Calls has 3 acts, which clearly ties in with kind of like beginning, middle, and end. And it also follows the 3 unities of time, place, and action. This is referring back to Greek theory. It's covered in the Inspector Calls videos. I'm not going to go into it in detail here. The point being that here you're covering form and stage directions. So Shakespeare uses very few stage directions, whereas J.B. Priestley uses very detailed stage directions. You can discuss stage directions in your points. Okay, so that's form again. I mean, obviously, acts and scenes, and whether you're referring to Act 1, Scene 2 or 3, then that's structure. Stagecraft. So this word refers to things on stage, which you can and should discuss if you are aiming for higher grades. How might a scene look on stage? How might an actor stand or move? What about lighting and music? So for plays in particular, you really need to think about stagecraft. And you should refer to audience, not reader. Okay. So here we've mostly talked about form, but in terms of structure, for example, you might talk about how Inspector Calls each act ends on a cliffhanger and then moves straight onto the next kind of scene and the next act. And then in terms of poetry, so sonnets are easy to identify in terms of form, but what about other forms? Is it a dramatic monologue? Is it blank verse? Is it free verse? I'm not going to define these here. There are other videos for that. And then rhyme and rhythm, as mentioned earlier, this is to do with form, although some people categorize it under structure. But the point is, you should discuss it, although it does not need to be a detailed discussion. Okay, so to summarize the grade 6 7 discussion, so for language, you might analyze the line. So, by the way, here I'm assuming that you've done all the grade 4 5 stuff, but you're aiming higher. Okay. So, you've done everything that you're supposed to do for the lower grades. And now for the higher grades, you might analyze the line, the hand that marked. So, for example, this line is considered to be difficult. You might pick out the adjectives vast and colossal and discuss the use of a semantic field of words that mean big. So, semantic field is an advanced term. And then for form, as well as saying it's a sonnet and so on, you would analyze the rhyme and rhythm scheme, noticing that it breaks down in some cases. You might mention iambic pentameter. So again, I'm not going to go into the actual details. For that, you need to watch the poetry videos and the other videos. And then in terms of structure, you might say that the poem begins with a description of the statue, moves on to the pedestal, and then zooms out to the surrounding sand, in addition to the point about how it starts with in the first person and then but mostly is in the third person. Okay, now we're coming towards the end, and I'm just going to discuss this now in terms of grade 8 9. But just to notice here, this discussion is for interest only. Okay, you would not actually put any of this into a GCSE essay, but students who aim for grade 8 9 obviously tend to be quite ambitious and are interested in these things. And indirectly, this discussion will help you with the points that you're going to make and hopefully grade 8, 9 points that you're going to make. So form and structure are very much intertwined, as can be seen from the fact that there is a debate as to whether rhyme and rhythm are to do with form or structure. But the truth is that even language cannot be separated. If we consider a sonnet as an example, okay, you could do this with other pieces of text, but it's easier with this example here. So, a sonnet is usually defined as a poem of 14 lines with a regular rhyme scheme and usually written in iambic pentameter, i.e., a rhythm scheme of 10 syllables per line. So, first of all, you can see straight away from the definition that the rhyme and the rhythm are to do with form. Okay, so that's why with the form of a sonnet, which is why I tend to agree with those people who say that rhyme and rhythm are to do with form. Okay, but now, so what I've done here is I've taken Ozymandias. So there you can see the original poem, 14 lines, and there's a rhyme scheme, and each line has roughly 10 syllables. Okay, and I've changed it so that there's two lines on each line. But now notice that by changing the number of lines, so from 14 to 7, and by having two lines per line, so I've got now 20 syllables per line. So in other words, this is no longer a sonnet, okay, because it doesn't have 14 lines and it's got 20 syllables per line. But notice by changing the rhyme, sorry, by changing the number of lines and the number of syllables, right, I've changed the physical structure. This looks completely different to that. This is no longer a sonnet because it doesn't have 14 lines and it doesn't have 10 syllables per line. So can you see how rhyme and rhythm, in other words, the form, are interconnected with structure? The minute you change one, you automatically change the other thing. Okay, so that's why you can see why some people say that rhyme and rhythm are to do with structure. The truth is, you can't really separate the two things out. But now think about rhyme. Okay, so we have land and sand; they rhyme. Okay, but what is but rhyming is to do with words, right? But what are words? Words are to do with language. So can you see that not only can you separate out form and structure, you can't actually separate out language either. Okay, so as I said, this is just for interest only. It was a grade 8, 9 discussion. Hopefully, if you are aiming for those kind of grades, you've understood this discussion. If not, don't worry about it, or maybe come back to it. So you wouldn't put any of this into your essay, but hopefully that adds to your knowledge, which will inform the points that you make in terms of language, form, and structure. Okay. All right. So here is an overall summary. I've only summarized the basic stuff. If you want to revise the more advanced stuff, please go back and watch the video again. But like I say, even if you remember the basics, hopefully that will trigger your memory to remind you to about the more advanced points as well. So in simple terms, language means words and phrases, form means type or genre, structure means beginning, middle, and end. And don't forget, form also has subtypes, subgenres. Structure does not mean layout, although layout can be a small part of it, especially in poetry. Abstract means non-physical. And when we talk about structure, the one word structure, we're normally talking about abstract structure. So the content, the beginning, middle, and end. If you specifically want to talk about layout, you can talk about physical structure. You only really need to worry about the difference between language and structure in language paper 1, question 3, the structure question, but please don't spend more than 10 minutes on this question. In the language papers, the questions actually remind you what these terms mean. All right. So if you forget, it's right there. For literature, the most basic thing to remember is to refer to the text using the correct term. For example, novel, play, or poem, and to select the correct term between reader and audience. So normally it's reader, but if you're talking about plays, it's audience. And with plays, remember, stagecraft is very important as well. How things would look on stage and sound on stage. Other things to remember: chapter organization for novels, acts and scenes, and stage directions for plays, okay, and how things might look on the stage. Type of poem, for example, sonnet. If you want to check your answers, just kind of go back to the previous slide. And that's it. I hope you found that video useful. It's a topic that people often get confused about. The basics are not difficult, okay? It's really just about using the correct terms. If you're aiming higher, then hopefully this video has given you the information to do that. So I hope you found that video useful. And if you did, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And I will see you in the next video.